So the title of my talk today is the somewhat seductive Could She Be by Caravaggio? And I gave the talk this title with some trepidation, realizing that Caravaggio is the closest that there is to a celebrity among old master painters. He's been the subject of not one but 3 biographies in the last decade or so, 2 of which are to be avoided. Partly because once Caravaggio comes into the equation, people tend to lose perspective and expect that every painting is a masterpiece, everything is sensational, everything reflects the turbulent end of his life, everything reflects, well, not just the end, the turbulent events of his life, etc., etc., etc. The biography often takes over the painting. And a work like this, from very early in the artist's life, if indeed it is by him, doesn't fit that celebrity psychological paradigm that we have created for Caravaggio. And so it's a problematic attribution, not just in its own right, but also in terms of how many people go about doing the business of art history today, and how art history tends to be filtered out from a few scholars to mass consumption in movies, television shows, popular biographies, and museum exhibitions. Going back to the beginning of the story, though, this work first came to light in the late 1920s when it appeared at an auction, and at which time it was attributed to the artist Sofonisba Anguissola, who worked in Cremona and in Spain and elsewhere in the late 16th century. Soon after it reached the public, though, a curator named Hermann Voss, a curator in Berlin, a connoisseur of some note, a great expert on Roman painting, later discredited because he collaborated with the Nazis and became curator of Hitler's museum. Long before that, though, Hans Posse said, you know, that painting could practically be the pendant painting to the portrait of Figlia dei Malandroni, this woman who served as a model in many of Caravaggio's paintings, of whom Caravaggio did an independent portrait. That painting could practically be a pendant to this nuke painting, the one now in San Diego, so much so that this is very likely to be by Caravaggio. At the time, no one paid all that much attention to this. This was a statement made in the 30s, and it's really only beginning in the late 40s that insanity over the artist Caravaggio even begins to develop. So when this work was acquired by the museum in 1942, yes, the museum had acquired a work by a famous Roman Baroque artist, but it was nothing like it received nothing like the attention that an acquisition of a Caravaggio would meet today. And it was an attribution sort of quietly accepted. After all, Voss was the curator in charge of this painting, which had been in Berlin, which was subsequently destroyed during the war. So no one has seen this since 1945. But the man who arguably knew it best linked this canvas to the Figlia dei Malandroni portrait. Over the years, as the fascination with Caravaggio grew and grew to the point where he is now the artist who is the subject of the greatest number of art historical books being produced today, at least among old masters, the painting fell out of favor and it was dismissed. Oh, it's not by Caravaggio. Oh, it's a copy perhaps of some lost portrait by him. Oh, perhaps it's not Caravaggio but one of his followers in Rome like Ottavio Leoni. Never mind that nothing else by Leoni looks like this. It's a painting that has been in obscurity here in San Diego. It's only once traveled back to Italy where it could be compared with other works by the master, and which in the scholarship kind of found itself relegated to the ranks of anonymous Lombard or Roman master circa 1590 to 1600. But I think the painting deserves a bit more attention than that, and for a few reasons. One is, in addition to the similarity to the Figlia dei Malandroni, it looks, or at least the face of it does, a lot like other early portraits, or other early paintings, rather, by Caravaggio, such as the famous lute player, which exists in multiple versions. I think you see a kind of similarity in the facial type, in the way that it was painted, or the musicians at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This attributional idea that Hermann Voss had deserves a bit more attention. But how do you reconcile the idea that it looks like Caravaggio and yet the dress is so terribly painted. The dress looks like it was a paint-by-numbers kit. There's absolutely no depth, no movement, no life to it. The lace is laid in with the most wooden of hands. How can the artist who became arguably the greatest master of his lifetime, the man who really changed the course of painting in Italy, how can he have done this? How could this be by such a great man, even if it's very early in his career? Well, one of the things that we have to think about first is that a portrait doesn't function like one of the great genre scenes. These pictures, the musicians, the lute player, the card sharps, the gypsy fortune tellers, are full of life. They were new subject matters. They are a kind of picture that had never been done before. And so the artist was faced with the challenge of bringing that to life. Whereas a portrait is something much more staid. And indeed, if you look at Caravaggio's other portraits, the Figli dei Malandroni no longer exists, but if one were to drive up to Los Angeles at the moment, you could see, for example, Maffeo Barberini, another picture long relegated to the not quite by Caravaggio pile, but recently resuscitated and now generally accepted as being by him. Caravaggio as a portraitist is not quite the artist with the verve of Caravaggio as of the card players, the musicians, the lute player, and the like. But there's still more to the story, which is that if you look carefully at this picture, you notice that as bad as the dress is, as flat as the flesh of the bust is painted, there's something much more lively going on in the face. That the face has this kind of shadowing, these rosy hues in the cheeks, this careful shading under the lips, which is completely absent or put in with the most leaden of gestures in the lower parts of the painting. And this is something that is even clearer when one looks at an X-ray of the painting. It becomes clear that this work is created in two different painterly styles. One style used for the face, and one used for the dress and the bust that's much more wooden. That means a couple of things, and I'll show you first what that means. So here's the X-ray. Now, X-rays are a little bit difficult to read. They read the depth and density of a painting. One of the things that shows up most in an X-ray of a painting is lead white. Lead white, a pigment made with lead, is very heavy, very dense, and X-ray opaque. So, for example, in the woman, you see her face here, in her bust, in her dress, you see how dense the painting is, how heavily it's painted. There are no changes, there's no subtlety. It looks as flat in the X-ray with this thick white paint as it does in the painting. But the face, which appears to the naked eye to be in a different style, is also painted in a very different style. There is none of that thick white paint setting out the figure such as there is down here. It's much more thinly, much more impressionistically painted, as if done at a different moment or perhaps by a different artist. Because one of the things that often happened in portrait painters' studios was that one guy set in the dress, often basing it on a dress left at the studio, put on a mannequin, painted in by an assistant, and then someone else came in and did the tough work of actually capturing an expression, which would be painted much more alla prima, much more directly from the subject, and not in this kind of wooden, slow way that the dress is painted. Now that this is in two different styles rules out one of the possibilities, which is that it's a copy. No copyist would work in two styles. A copyist would start here and copy from top to bottom, left to right, and it would be all in one technique. So that rules out one of the ways this painting has been rejected as being a copy of a lost work. It's not a copy. It's maybe by two hands, but it is an original picture. The other thing that's interesting about the X-ray is that if one flips it 180 degrees, you see now at the center an eye, a nose, a mustache here, perhaps. Can you read that? Another face here, and a third face, eye sockets, nose, small beard here. Their arms come down, and these can actually be seen in the painting. You see an arm coming down here. Remember, this other portrait, for which this canvas had been used first, was turned 180 degrees. Now, this portrait of three men in a rather small format picture such as this is not something you see in Rome, to which Caravaggio moved in 1593. It's a much more typical style of portrait up in the north of Italy, in Lombardy, in Emilia. Caravaggio was from the town of Caravaggio. He worked in Milan prior to coming to Rome. He is someone who reused his canvases in Rome, but lots of people reused canvases. Yet it seems that this canvas started life almost certainly in the north of Italy, rather than in Rome. So could this be one of those works then done by Caravaggio in those years prior to coming to Rome? We know that he trained with an artist named Simone Petrozzano, and then there's about a 4-year missing period in his life, where we know he's up north. He occasionally goes and pays taxes in Caravaggio. He's involved in various lawsuits. We don't really know what he did. We presume that he was a painter. There's some suspicion that he worked in a portrait painter's studio in Milan. And this would seem to fit that condition perfectly. Young artist, not in charge of anything. Of course, he's not going to sign his works. Gets a job working in a portrait painter's studio. So someone sets in a dress, and then this young guy who seems to have talent in capturing a likeness comes in and paints the face, which would explain why this would be in two different hands. It would also explain why the canvas seems to have started its life in Lombardy rather than in Rome. But that's really about as far as we can go, because we don't have any other paintings from the Milanese period. There are a few proposals out there, but they are even more highly debated than this work is. Nor do we have another painting done in Rome until the fairly late 1590s. So an almost 10-year gap would exist between this painting and the next portrait by Caravaggio to which we could compare it. And 10 years in the life of an artist, going from a provincial workshop in Milan to painting in Rome, surrounded by the greatest works of art in Italy at the time, you can't bridge that gap from one painting to the next. So, could it be by Caravaggio? I obviously think the answer is yes. It is, for me, the painting most likely to document his missing years of the beginning of his career in Milan. Is this a major discovery, though? Not really, because it's so far from the artist who would make some of the greatest paintings in the Italian tradition that ultimately it's nothing more than an academic, connoisseurial curiosity. It's great to have. It's a fantastic story to tell. There's an interesting object lesson, but ultimately it doesn't shed a whole lot of light on Caravaggio's career as a whole. But it does make a nice bridge between the documented painter training in the north and then the artist who appears in Rome, painting works like this on spec, and then skyrocketing into the patronage of the most discriminating connoisseurs in Italy and creating a series of works that forever change the course of Italian painting. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Can you speak to her hands?
Can I speak to her hands? They're pretty bad. I mean, I think the hands were frankly put in by the person who set out the dress. It's all part of this setup, essentially. It has been observed by at least one person that a woman with multiple chins might have had a chunkier hand than this rather delicate one down here. It's not particularly well done. It's just part of the same setup as the dress. It's fundamentally part of the dress. Ken?
How can you date this as prior to his Rome period?
Well, you can't date it absolutely because we don't know absolutely that it's by Caravaggio. I think there is a gap in quality between this and the earliest Roman paintings, but also the fact that it's on that Milanese or northern Italian-styled triple male portrait just suggests that it was done in the north. It's unlikely that Caravaggio would have carried a canvas down from the north and then reused it. A portrait, whoever commissioned the original portrait it wouldn't have left it to Caravaggio. I suspect that was something Caravaggio did in a portrait painter studio in the north that was never paid for, never picked up, never approved, and then he just reused the canvas. But that all points to Milan, where he was before, rather than Rome. There's no kind of technical analysis that would prove that the pigments are Roman rather than Lombard, or the canvas is one or the other. The materials were too consistent from one place to the next.
So let me make sure I understand you correctly. You're saying probably it is Caravaggio. Okay, I get that. Are we saying that perhaps the face definitely would have been done by someone as talented as Caravaggio, but perhaps the rest of the body
by an apprentice in a portrait painter's work, or not an apprentice, one of these guys who never quite makes it to the level of independent master, a tradesman, essentially. And remember, portrait painters' workshops, they were essentially storefronts. I mean, portrait painters were not the painters about, generally speaking, were not the painters about whom books are later written. Most portrait painters were tradesmen who were just interested in capturing a likeness and who did these kinds of setups. I can't believe that the face and the dress are painted by the same person. This, I can believe, could be by the young Caravaggio. This is by some anonymous artist. We'll never know. Chacha.
So you don't think it would be, if this were determined to be a Caravaggio in keeping when he was in the north, and wouldn't it kind of be the domino that kind of tips the other domino? So there's some other pieces that are even less, they think they might be Caravaggios, but are less likely so than them. Could that
right. I mean, if we accept this, then what other dominoes fall with it? It's an interesting question, and there is at least one scholar named Franco Moro who's working on a book just on this problem, who tells me that he plans to publish this Caravaggio as part of his reconstruction of this early career. I haven't seen any of those other paintings that fall in a logical series of dominoes, to play with your metaphor. I mean, it seems much more scattershot evidence, but I'm still, we're all still waiting to see what Moro's book will look like. Other early attempts to reconstruct an early career for Caravaggio have not hitherto proven convincing in any way, or to any great extent, I should say. So thank you all for coming. Come have a look.